For decades, Aerosmith lived on the edge, rising, crashing, and clawing their way back again. But in 1998, one song changed everything. A ballad tied to a Hollywood blockbuster didn't just top the charts, it made Aerosmith bigger than ever before. This is the story of how I Don't Want to Miss a Thing finally crowned them kings of the world. The struggle before the glory. To understand why I Don't Want to Miss a Thing became such a defining moment, you have to see the war Aerosmith fought to even stay alive as a band. Their story wasn't just about music, it was about survival. In the early 70s, Aerosmith came out swinging. They weren't polished, they weren't safe, but that was the point. Songs like Dream On and Sweet Emotion gave them credibility with critics and fans alike, showing they could be both ambitious and gritty. Then Walk This Way exploded, with its unforgettable riff and sly lyrics, putting Aerosmith shoulder to shoulder with rock's biggest names. For a while, it seemed like they couldn't lose. But behind the scenes, the band was unraveling. The endless touring schedule fed their addictions, and the press latched on to Steven Tyler and Joe Perry's destructive lifestyles. The two became known as the Toxic Twins, a nickname that sounded funny at the time, but was deadly serious. By 1979, the pressure was too much. Perry walked away during the recording of Night in the Ruts, and Brad Whitford followed soon after. Suddenly, Aerosmith's engine was sputtering, and their reputation went from dangerous to disastrous. The 1980s nearly killed them. Without Perry and Whitford, their albums tanked. Concerts drew smaller crowds. Other rock bands, Van Halen, Guns N' Roses, Mötley Crüe, were stealing the spotlight. Aerosmith looked like a band that had burned too bright, too fast. They were broke, broken, and fading. Then came the comeback no one saw coming. Perry and Whitford returned, and in an era when second chances rarely worked, Aerosmith pulled off one of the greatest comebacks in rock history. They sobered up, tightened their sound, and delivered Permanent Vacation in 1987. Suddenly, they were back on MTV, back on the charts, and back in the conversation. Pump pushed them higher, and by the time Get a Grip landed in 1993, they were rock's ultimate survivors. But even with platinum albums and sold-out arenas, there was one thing still out of reach. Aerosmith had the respect of rock fans, but they hadn't crossed fully into the mainstream. They were legends, yes, but not global pop culture rulers. That final leap was still waiting. And that's when Hollywood stepped in. Hollywood comes calling. By the late 90s, Aerosmith had already proven themselves as rock survivors. But their career was about to collide with something far bigger than the music industry. Hollywood. And it wasn't just any Hollywood project. It was one of the most hyped blockbusters of the decade. In 1998, director Michael Bay was preparing to unleash Armageddon, a big-budget disaster film about an asteroid hurtling toward Earth. The cast was stacked: Bruce Willis, Ben Affleck, and, most importantly for this story, Steven Tyler's daughter, Liv Tyler. The studio wanted everything about the movie to be larger than life, including the soundtrack. They didn't just want a hit, they wanted an anthem. Enter Diane Warren. By this time, she was already a powerhouse songwriter, with a reputation for penning emotional ballads that climbed straight to the top of the charts. Her songs had been recorded by Celine Dion, Whitney Houston, and countless others. When Bay and the producers asked her to create a song that could capture the love, sacrifice, and heartbreak at the heart of Armageddon, Warren delivered, I Don't Want to Miss a Thing. The song was epic, haunting verses that built into a towering chorus, with lyrics about never wanting to lose a single moment with someone you love. The producers knew it had the potential to be massive. All they needed was the right voice to bring it to life. That's when they turned to Aerosmith. On paper, it was an odd choice. This was a band known for gritty, bluesy rock and raucous stage shows, not sweeping orchestral ballads. Aerosmith rarely performed songs they hadn't written themselves, and the thought of taking on a Diane Warren composition raised eyebrows within the band. Some of them worried it might feel like a sellout move. But there were two things that changed everything. First, the timing. Aerosmith were at a point in their career where they had nothing left to prove to rock fans. They had already done it all. Second, and more personal, Liv Tyler was starring in the film. For Steven Tyler, recording this song wasn't just about chasing another hit. It was about being part of his daughter's breakout moment. With that personal connection in mind, Aerosmith agreed. They stepped into the studio to record I Don't Want to Miss a Thing. None of them could have predicted just how much this decision would reshape the rest of their career. And once the first notes were recorded, it was clear this wasn't going to be just another Aerosmith song. It was going to be something historic. The sound that changed everything. When Aerosmith finally committed to recording I Don't Want to Miss a Thing, no one expected it to feel so different, even inside the studio. From the very first notes, it was obvious this wasn't going to be a typical Aerosmith track. Gone were the gritty guitar licks that had powered hits like Walk This Way or Back in the Saddle. Instead, the song opened with a tender piano line, almost fragile, as if inviting the listener into something more intimate. Then came the strings, soaring, cinematic, designed to match the drama of a world-ending movie. For a band rooted in blues and hard rock, this lush orchestration was new territory. But what truly made the track unforgettable was Steven Tyler's voice. By this point in his career, Tyler had screamed and wailed his way through countless rock anthems, but this time, he held nothing back emotionally. When he sang, "I could stay awake just to hear you breathing," it didn't sound like a rock star performing. It sounded like a father, a lover, a man terrified of missing life's most precious moments. And that connection was real. With Liv Tyler starring in Armageddon, Steven couldn't help but pour his personal feelings into the performance. It was as if he was singing directly to her, and that authenticity turned the song from a movie tie-in into something timeless. The band members themselves admitted it felt strange. They were used to building songs around Perry's riffs, or Whitford's grooves, not around a pre-written ballad, but even skeptics inside the group had to admit that once the final mix came together, it was undeniable. This wasn't just a soundtrack song, it was an anthem. When the band listened back to the completed track, the reaction was unanimous. This was special, and when the public finally heard it, the impact was explosive. Because once the world got its first taste, Aerosmith were about to experience a level of success they had never known before. Global reception and impact. When I Don't Want to Miss a Thing was released in the summer of 1998, it didn't just climb the charts, it exploded. Practically overnight, the song became a cultural juggernaut. In the US, it shot to the top of the Billboard Hot 100 and stayed there for 4 straight weeks. For a band with nearly 3 decades of hits, it was astonishingly their first and only #1 single in America. The success wasn't limited to the US either. Across the Atlantic, the song soared to #1 in the UK, making it Aerosmith's first chart-topping single there as well. From Germany to Japan, from Australia to Brazil, the song dominated radio stations and music television, proving it wasn't just an American phenomenon, it was global. And then there was the film. Armageddon was one of the year's biggest blockbusters, and every emotional scene seemed to circle back to the song. The official music video, which wove together Aerosmith's performance with dramatic clips from the movie, only amplified the impact. Seeing Steven Tyler sing, while Liv Tyler's tearful face appeared on screen, created a father-daughter connection that audiences couldn't forget. It blurred the lines between the movie's fiction and the band's reality, giving the song a resonance that few soundtrack singles ever achieve. Awards recognition followed quickly. The track earned an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Song and a Grammy nomination for Best Pop Performance. Though it didn't win, the nomination cemented its status as more than just a radio hit. It was an event. Culturally, the song became unavoidable. It played at proms, weddings, and even funerals. Couples adopted it as their song. Radio stations put it on repeat. For people who had never heard of Aerosmith before, this ballad was their introduction, and it made the band household names in places they had never reached. In the end, I Don't Want to Miss a Thing did what decades of hits and tours had never fully achieved. It made Aerosmith the world's band, not just America's rock survivors. But with global fame came criticism, and not everyone was ready to celebrate this new version of Aerosmith. Backlash and controversy. For every fan who fell in love with I Don't Want to Miss a Thing, there was another who hated it. Hardcore Aerosmith devotees, the ones who had been there since Dream On and Toys in the Attic, felt blindsided. To them, Aerosmith were supposed to be the bad boys of Boston, the gritty, blues-driven band that lived on chaos and swagger. Seeing them perform a glossy Diane Warren ballad with strings and orchestration felt like a betrayal. Critics sharpened their knives. Some rock magazines dismissed the song as syrupy, accusing Aerosmith of abandoning their roots in exchange for commercial success. Others pointed out the irony that after decades of writing their own material, their biggest hit was penned by someone outside the band. To purists, it seemed like Aerosmith had lost their identity at the very moment they achieved their greatest victory. The band heard the backlash, and it stung. Steven Tyler, however, didn't flinch. In interviews, he acknowledged the criticism but brushed it off. "If you can't handle us having a #1 hit, that's your problem," he once quipped. Joe Perry was more conflicted, admitting that while the song wasn't his style, he couldn't deny the impact it had. Deep down, they all knew the truth. "I Don't Want to Miss a Thing" had given them a global reach that decades of riff-driven rock hadn't. And while critics debated their authenticity, the mainstream didn't care. The song kept climbing. Couples kept dedicating it to each other, and Armageddon kept pushing it into new markets. For every fan who complained about Aerosmith selling out, 10 more were discovering the band for the first time. In the end, the backlash became part of the story. The contrast between Aerosmith's gritty past and their polished ballad only made the narrative more compelling. They had gone from the Toxic Twins barely surviving the 80s to topping charts in countries they had never toured in before. And once the dust settled, the song's legacy would prove that sometimes, even a controversial move can define a career. Legacy of that moment. Years after its release, I Don't Want to Miss a Thing still stands as one of the most surprising twists in Aerosmith's career. What was meant to be a movie tie-in became the song that defined them to millions of listeners who had never touched a hard rock record before. For couples walking down the aisle, teenagers slow dancing at prom, or families grieving at funerals, it became a soundtrack to life's biggest emotions. That kind of cultural reach is something even Aerosmith's rawest classics never quite achieved. The success of the song also reshaped the band's reputation. Before 1998, Aerosmith were survivors, respected legends who had clawed their way back from the brink. After 1998, they were global icons. The single gave them new commercial power, fueling massive tours through the early 2000s. Crowds across Europe, Asia, and South America were now filled not only with longtime rock fans, but also with people who had discovered them through that single soaring ballad. It also gave Aerosmith a kind of immortality. Even in the streaming era, where younger generations often overlook older rock, I Don't Want to Miss a Thing continues to rack up millions of plays every year. On Spotify and YouTube, it sits at the top of their most played tracks, standing shoulder to shoulder with Dream On and Walk This Way. For some, it's their first gateway into the band's catalog. For others, it's the one song they know, but it's enough to keep Aerosmith's name alive. And perhaps the greatest irony of all is that this defining anthem wasn't written by them. For a band that prided itself on its raw, self-made identity, their most enduring success came from surrendering to something outside of their comfort zone. Instead of diminishing them, it proved their adaptability. Aerosmith showed that after 3 decades of reinvention, they could still surprise the world, and themselves. In the end, the song became more than just a soundtrack to Armageddon. It became a soundtrack to survival, to love, to resilience. For Aerosmith, it was the final confirmation that they hadn't just lived through rock's wildest decades, they had conquered them. And it all started with a song they almost didn't record. Aerosmith's wildest success didn't come from a riff or a raw rocker. It came from a ballad they never planned to record. I Don't Want to Miss a Thing wasn't just a hit. It was the moment they conquered the world. But what do you think? Was this their crowning achievement or their ultimate sellout? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Backstage Melody, where legends, lyrics, and secrets collide.